Hi, Peter Linneman here. I know we tried to do the webinar at 1 o'clock on Eastern Time on Thursday. System got apparently overwhelmed. For that, we apologize. And what we've decided to do is just record this. And like everybody working from home office, we're trying to make the best of the situation. Let me say that I'm not an immunologist, though in the last 10 days, like many of you, I've read more immunology than I ever hoped to and spoken to a number of people who are specialists in that. And while I think I'm an economist still, none of the events that are occurring are events that anybody has ever modeled or analyzed before. And so I'm just going to try to give you my thoughts as they exist at this time, and it's an ongoing process. The first thing is no one knows. There's no immunologist who knows. There's no politician certainly who knows. There's no economist that knows. There's no business person that knows. That's an important thing, I think, to understand, is that you're not alone in not knowing. As to the disease, they believe it jumped from a pangolin, probably in a wet market in Wuhan, probably in the third week of November. I was probably one of the few people that will listen to this that knew what a pangolin was prior to this event. Because I go to Kenya every year, some of you know, for our charity, Save a Mind, Give a Choice. And I've asked my guides there who have lived there all their life and go out every day looking for animals, have they ever seen a pangolin? And they're so rare that none of them have ever seen them. And what happened was someone ate this and a disease jumped species. And therefore we have no immunity to these diseases. And the animal's rare, so it's probably not interacted with many of the animals we've interacted with over time. Like any virus, my understanding is it either dies or it finds new hosts. And we're the hosts that it's searching for. We human beings are the hosts that it's searching for. And if it finds a new host, you either get better, in which case you will almost certainly have a high level of immunity against it again, or you die, in which case it will probably die with you. There are, as a result, two alternative views of how you might deal with something like this that I have seen. One is, I'm going to overstate it, expose everybody right now to it. Many people will not get it because of whatever reason. Most of those who get it appear to get it quite mild, including not even knowing that they have it. Some get it, probably about 20%, we don't know the exact number, get it and have quite unpleasant symptoms, and 1 to 3% that get it have very bad symptoms and very bad suffering, respiratory and otherwise, including death. So one view is expose everybody, give it all the hosts at once, and it'll use up its hosts, and therefore, when it's done, it's done. And that approach is extreme and has expense associated with it, and a lot of illness and a lot of loss of life. That's the version that says live life completely the way you always did, and you'll just get a lot of people sick, but not everybody by any means, and you'll get some very sick and some die, and then when it's over, or pretty much when it's over, particularly given that it does not appear to be mutating. It appears to be maintaining the form. They have mapped it genetically, although that doesn't mean they get a vaccine. they've mapped Hep C, they've mapped HIV. Genetically, we don't have vaccines against those. So just being able to map it doesn't mean you'll have vaccines. The alternative is deprive it of hosts by isolating and obviously sanitation. And by isolating, what you say is, yes, some people have it, and it'll run its course by either them getting over it or them dying, but there's no new host for it, and so it will die. And that's the isolating. You add to the isolation notion that in the United States, we have about 1 million hospital beds. I'm rounding. 70% of those are typically occupied. So if we eliminated a lot of the elective stuff, maybe we have an incremental 500,000 beds in the United States, but they may not match where the sickness is occurring. We have about 65,000 ICU beds and another 50,000 surgical neurological beds, but we only have about 100,000 ventilators in the United States. That's a lot, but if this starts affecting millions of people in the extreme, you see why they say the medical system gets overloaded. Hence, one of the things the proponents of isolation are saying is by isolating it, you'll slow it down so that you don't get peak illness, so you don't exceed the hospital system's capacity to service, and also you can therefore save a bit more lives as you go. The problem with that is, obviously, it lasts a lot longer. And yes, you may not get the system overloaded, but you might run right at system max, and you do it for a real long time because isolation probably isn't going to be perfect as a solution. It might be very good, but not perfect. So that's sort of the spirit of this. Most of the countries in the world, including the United States now, have decided let's take the isolation approach, starve it of hosts that way. Hopefully we can contain it. There is a hope that when you talk to the immunologist, but remember they don't know because they've not encountered this before, is that it would go the way of SARS and the flu and many of these common cold, that it would go that warm weather either kills or makes it very difficult for the virus to thrive. And for example, SARS, just as it was really taking off, the spring weather hit, it disappeared and has yet to reappear in the subsequent years. And of course, if you think of spring, warming is going to perchance kill this. Isolating looks like a very good alternative, at least for a short while, certainly from a medical point of view. But that isolation is coming at an extraordinary and probably unprecedented cost to the economy, and that's where I'll come to. Not only has life changed, people aren't seeing one another, we're social animals, and we're not seeing one another, we're not interacting, we're not being as creative sitting in our home office as we would be together, etc. It is important to understand that through the first week of March, the economy on almost every metric was doing very well and was quite solid. Yes, there was a little issues around the trade and manufacturing, but most businesses were at their all-time highs. They were all doing quite well. And even single-family housing production was creeping back within sight of normal. Construction activity was under decent control, actually running a little below its historic norm, keeping most real estate markets in decent supply and demand balance. So if you went to, say, a nail salon in the first week of March and you said, how's business? They'd have said, never been better. Okay, we now have shut down. And we've shut down for a week, and we're going to probably shut down for at least another week and possibly another month and another month until we decide it's either dead or we can't afford to shut down. We basically are now down to an economy of government, which is not the most productive sector in terms of moving a society forward in general. Food, but only basic food, medical, and then Perel and toilet tissue. That's essentially our economy at this point. My guess is that in reality, the production of the U.S. has probably fallen at least 10% in the last week or so. It could be as much as 30 or 40% if this continues a few more weeks. Why do I say that? Well, Las Vegas is shut. Las Vegas is shut. Orlando is shut. And those two cities have combined about 600,000 hospitality and leisure workers, none of whom are working. 600,000 simply in two cities. If you added the hospitality leisure workers in Chicago and New York, and in fact, we have about 15 million in the hospitality, leisure, and related businesses in the United States. That's 10% of the labor force. 10% of the labor force. That is essentially doing nothing. So when I say the drops could be easily in the 10 to 35 or 40% range quite quickly, you see why I say that. And I haven't even added all the other activities that aren't occurring. If you say we lose activity for a week or two, it's not a big deal. For example, the last week in August is a pretty dead week and the economy goes on just fine. And the Christmas holiday week, other than retail, is dead, but it goes on fine. But if we were to lose 30 to 40% of the economy for just 5 weeks, 10% of the year, 5 weeks is about 10% of the year, losing 30 to 40% of the economy for 10% of the year means 3 to 4% of the economy just disappeared. And it'll be highly concentrated in retail. It'll be highly concentrated among new college and high school graduates. It'll be highly concentrated among hospitality and leisure workers, etc. And you can know exactly. If the cost of this is 3 to 4% of GDP, and I'm just using GDP as a crude metric, we have a $21 trillion GDP. GDP per week is about $413 billion. So we have a lot of activity out there. If we lose in 5 weeks of shutdown 3 to 4% of GDP, and the cost of that is that we, in return, we get 1% of the population doesn't die. We have about 330 million people. So if you say, okay, we shut down for 5 weeks, we lose 3 to 4% of GDP, and you do the math of that for 330 million people, 1%, you're basically at $1 million per life. And of course, remember, not everybody is going to get sick. So the death rate among those infected appears closer to 1%. So it could be as much as $2 million per life. And that's if all we've done is for 5 weeks. If we do it for 10 weeks, double that. If we do it for another 5 weeks and another 5 weeks, the cost becomes astronomical. And another way of saying it, if this goes on very long, we may save lives, but not to be brutal about it, the cost could be $4 to $10 million for each life, and many of those didn't have long life expectancies to start with because of their various chronic diseases. And so the question is, are we willing as a society, if this doesn't get better in the next month, Are we willing to give up 20 to 50% of our GDP to save perhaps somewhere between 1 million and 3 million lives? Just as a footnote, you need to understand that the death rates that are being talked about are not like the death rates associated with flu, where they have very good algorithms about how many people report they're sick versus those that actually die and they've got a lot of experience. We don't know how many people are infected. So all they're really doing is reporting deaths relative to reported cases, and they don't have good algorithms to know how many unreported. The bad news is if they really had a good idea of how many are unreported, there'd be a lot more people affected by it. The deaths are actually the same in either case, so the infection rate would go way up, but the death rate would go down and the absolute number of deaths stays the same. And that's why the death rates on this could be massively lower than the 1% to 2% numbers people are saying. But they also could be those. And I repeat, nobody knows. It obviously, to me, makes sense to see if warming does help, and if it does, isolate and bear that cost. But if warming doesn't do it, and they're not going to come up with a vaccine in the next week, and they're not going to come up with a vaccine in the next 3 weeks. That's just wishful thinking. As I said, we haven't gotten vaccines for Hep C and so forth. They've been working for years and years. That doesn't mean they may not come up with better treatment protocols, and people are working very hard in that regard. But there's a chance that within about a month, we are going to have a hard decision that says we accept this as a threat on life, just like cancer and diabetes and heart disease and traffic deaths and the flu. And we take the best defensive mechanisms we can, but get on with life. My guess is those defensive mechanisms would be the most vulnerable in society, do get more isolated. You can imagine retirement communities being very protective. People use masks and gloves in normal part of their life, as this happened in Japan for many years. But we get on with it. And in the meantime, we hope for a cure or a treatment protocol or a vaccine. But we get on with life. We get on with it in an adjusted way. We open up hotels. We open up travel. We open up the economy again. And I point out auto. We can solve all auto deaths. It's very easy. We can solve all traffic deaths by simply allowing no one ever to drive anything. And the problem is, I'll never have a traffic death if I don't drive. If we all sit in our apartment and never leave, we basically are never going to get corona and die from it. But it's too excessive a cost, is what society has said. And there's a good chance that in a month, we're going to have to make this decision of, do we go back to real life, but taking protective measures that we did not heretofore take? And I use masks and gloves as a good example. Now, turning to things like the Fed and so forth. All right, what about the Fed? Cutting interest rates does nothing. This has nothing. I don't think cutting interest rates does much in the first place, even if it's typical economics. There's not real evidence of that. Cutting rates does nothing here. It helps short-term borrowers, and it hurts short-term lenders. It's that simple. You're taking money from the lender, and you're giving it to the borrower. And that's it. It's not what if somebody's going to say the interest rate's lower, so I'm going to borrow a lot of money so I can go to Disney. They're not going to do that. They can't go to Disney. Or I'm going to borrow money because the rate's really low and I will build a factory. Nobody's going to build a factory right now in this degree of real uncertainty. The Fed can do. It is important to understand that this is a government-created shutdown. It's not a government-created disease, but it's a government-created shutdown. It is requiring people to not do things, and therefore the government intervening to offset itself in a way is quite useful and providing liquidity. The problem is it's very nice to talk about providing liquidity, but what does it mean? How do I get liquidity to those 600,000 workers who are out of jobs in Vegas and Orlando? How do I really find them? How about the nail salon with 2 employees that has to make rent and payroll next month? How do I get them the money? And how do I get it to them fast enough for them to stay in business? And you start seeing the difficulty of planning in general is it's easy to have concepts, but to make stuff happen. And in an odd way, it was one of the advantages China had in this is they already had a lot of those mechanisms set up, particularly through their state-owned enterprises, which are a huge part of their economy. So I think the Fed should be providing liquidity in the sense that it is, quote, not the borrower's fault. They should clearly jawbone and say, dear banks, we saved you 12 years ago. Don't forget we saved you. We jammed you full of excess reserves. We're going to backstop you. Use the money. Don't get hard. Don't get off your high horse. Don't think you're superior just because these people can't pay you. It is not their fault. Work with them, work with them, work with them, work with the nail salon, work with the companies, and keep them alive for society. Having said that, that doesn't help. These actions don't help non-borrowers. And the nail salon probably doesn't have a loan. So even if the Fed intervenes and the banks give a cushion, that doesn't help all those businesses, all the small businesses that really don't have loans. It doesn't help people who don't have loans. And if somebody walks in and says, I've got a nail salon, we haven't had a customer for 3 weeks, you want to make me a loan, the banks are going to be so overwhelmed dealing with the borrowers they already have, it's unlikely they're going to say, oh, we're glad you walked in, let us give you a loan. So there's enormous practicality issues associated with all this. The Fed, though, should make that if the money goes in, it does go out. And one of the inhibitions to that has been stress tests. So on the one hand, you can put money in, but if the stress test says it doesn't come out because they're afraid the bank will fail, you may as well not put it in. They've got to adjust the stress test or ignore the stress test and say, we're putting money in to get it out. And by the way, we wanted you to get it out, not only, quote, to the credit worthy, we wanted to get it out to the nail salon. We want you to get it out to that consumer who had worked in Las Vegas at one of the hotels for 14 years that lost their job. We really want that. This situation we're in is both medical, but once you shut it down, there is a real chance of just dramatic drops in GDP, unprecedented drops in GDP. The nail salon I mentioned, in a normal downturn, including 2008-9, their business didn't disappear. It's that they had a few fewer customers. They had 5, 10, 15% fewer customers, and it took several months for that to occur. This is overnight, they have 0 customers. And by the way, next week, they're going to have 0 customers. This is not business as usual. In terms of jobs, you have to realize that anybody graduating from high school, college, starting out their career, returning from the military, nobody's going to hire right now. How many of you are saying, yep, we're actively interviewing, we just hired somebody tomorrow, we're really working on it? That means that about each month, about 200,000 people retire or die who are working about 200,000. So each month, if we don't hire, employment will fall by about 200,000. That's if all we do is don't hire, but people retire and die. Employment will fall 200,000 a month. That means over a year, if we kept this up, we'd have 2.4 million decline in jobs, even though we didn't fire a soul. And then when you add on top of it, we shut down the hotels, people got furloughed, people got let go, etc. You see how this could be staggering in its magnitude, in that you have whole sectors 100% shut down, just 100% shut down. So it can't go on very long. Hotels, are existent only because some people are stuck somewhere. Home building exists only on the pipeline of homes that is already underway, but home builders, several of the major home builders have announced, particularly in California, that they're just stopping new home building completely. And by the way, why not wait a month? Why not wait 2 months to see what will happen? If you go by sector, retail is dead unless you're groceries, drugstores. You're dead, right? What else is anybody buying other than groceries and pharmacy goods? So that your situation is that the typical retail center probably has an average of a 7-year lease. That means that every month, about 1.2% of all your existing leases expire each month. And by the way, if you're that nail salon, if you're the little restaurant, and your lease happens to be expiring and you haven't signed the lease yet, I'm not sure you're going to rush to sign the lease. So every month that this continues, you could lose 1.2% simply on I didn't renew, not to mention I went out of business. And of course, what therefore is going to happen is that landlords are going to have to decide, am I going to step forward and support that little restaurant that's closed, and it's been closed for 3 weeks, and it could be closed another 2 months or 3 months? Am I going to support it even though it's not operating? Am I going to support the nail salon? And that will be dramatic. The other is, even if I'm a business, and this is going to occur across the board, do I really want to pay my rent this month? Why? Why wouldn't I just hoard the cash? They can't get rid of me in a month. What are they going to do? They being the landlord. So if you're a landlord, particularly in retail, cash becomes king because you're going to get a spike in non-payables. Some who can't pay, the nail salon I described. Some who say, why would I pay? Because I don't know how bad I get, and I may as well hoard my cash for myself rather than give it to the landlord. I could always give it to them later, I suppose. And this could continue for several months in retail. If you go to the malls are all closed, basically. So I don't even know how you function. It's like Las Vegas. It's like Orlando. They are essentially non-functioning, huge economic engines. And there's going to have to be huge forbearance. Who knows if you'll ever collect it? And you're going to get tenants simply saying, I'm not going to pay the rent. Let the landlord come after me. I want to keep the cash in the meantime. It's the you can only kill me once phenomena. And so I think you need to be prepared for that. On the warehouse side, yes, online activity has picked up, although even Amazon has said they're going to limit themselves to the activities they conduct. Credit tenants will probably keep paying. The online credit tenants that still have active businesses will probably keep paying. The grocery stores, the drugstores. But the party that's supplying to the nail salons and to the little local vendors we were talking about, they've got goods in a warehouse that are just going to sit there. Their tendency is going to be not to pay. At least I think that's going to be their tendency. Namely, I'd rather keep cash. Typical lease and warehouse, probably 5 years, means about 1.7% new leases per month. This of which probably half are credit worthy, half are not. So you could see about 1% a month not renewing, simply because unless you give me a big inducement and you carry me, landlord, for the next couple of months, I can't renew. I don't know. And then you go beyond that, even those who have leases aren't going to pay. And if this goes on very long, then what happens is you get real businesses going out of business. Profit margins aren't that big. All of you know profit margins. They aren't that big. Multifamily, in some ways, is the best sector right now, other than Purell and toilet paper. Probably the best sector because people have to live somewhere. However, a couple of adverse things. All those high school, college grads, people returning from the military that in a good economy go get an apartment to start their lives, there are no jobs for them right now. So they're going to double up at home or with friends or girlfriends or boyfriends. So what has been a source of demand for you and growth isn't going to get jobs. And as a result, you're going to see in the next few months, if this goes very long, kind of a drying up of the normal demand from those entry-level people. Remember that you get about 8 to 8.5% of your leases roll in a typical month. 1 year being a typical lease, 1/12 per month. You get about 8% of your leases going. By the way, some of your residents just die in the normal course of things or move to assisted living or something. So you're getting built-in vacancy occurring. Now, the good news is you're not going to get many people in the next month or 2 or 3 moving into a single-family home that they bought because of the lack of confidence, the lack of down payment, the lack of jobs. So you're going to keep them. But anybody you lose, there's not somebody to replace them because this pipeline of young graduates and returning military is returning and graduating, but they don't have jobs. So you could see vacancies go up. If this lasts more than a few weeks, you could see vacancies move up very rapidly in multifamily simply because there's no one to move in. And remember, 8.3% is a typical monthly rollover. So it's not hard to envision that if half of that didn't fill for 2 or 3 months, you go from a very healthy 3, 4, 5% vacancy rate to 13 to 17% vacancies because there's nobody that has a job on the other side. The other issue multifamily has is that why would I pay my rent? If I was the typical American, there's always this number that people don't know where they would come up with the money for a $400 emergency. Well, the $400 emergency has occurred. They've lost their job, or they're not sure they're going to have their job, or their kid didn't get a job, and they don't have the money. So some of them don't have the money now to pay their rent. These are good people. These are not, people trying to cheat. These are good people who lost their job at the nail salon, or they lost their job driving a cab because nobody's taking cabs, or they were the cleaning person at the airport or the basketball game. They were the ticket taker at the basketball game. These are real people, but they don't have the income or they don't have the security of the income. So either they can't pay or they're not sure they can pay. You're going to see your accounts receivable go up. And I suspect apartments are going to see accounts receivable go from what your normal number is to probably 10 to 20, could even be 30 or 40% of the people not paying their rent. And if you try to evict them, I just don't think you're going to succeed. Now, if they're drug addicts or something, you'll probably succeed. But I'm talking about real people, normal people. You try to evict them. So you're going to have to work with them, and collecting back rent on apartments is one of the most difficult things ever. So expect your receivables to skyrocket in multifamily if this lasts more than another week or two. Senior housing. Senior housing has a very difficult challenge right now, which is, would I move mom into independent living now when you're worried about health and lockdown and mom's already isolated enough? I don't need to do so. Independent living, new demand, is essentially going to disappear over the next several months. And again, they have about a 6 to 7 year stay normally, so they're going to lose occupancy around 1 to 1.5% a year anyway. Per month, 1 to 1.5% loss of occupancy per month. How do they lose them? Death, or they move into assisted living, or they move into nursing. So you're going to see independent get hit very hard because nothing's coming in, but things are going out. Things are going out via death or via moving into assisted or moving into nursing. So I would expect the vacancy rates, if this lasts more than a couple of more weeks, you're going to see vacancies go up quite dramatically in independent living very rapidly. And again, I suspect you're going to get some families saying, we just aren't going to pay. And your accounts receivable are going to go up because I don't think you're going to take the risk of throwing grandmother out in this scenario. And while the government says, oh, we're going to give you money and we're going to give you money, I don't know that they'll find you in time to solve all this. In an odd way, assisted living will do kind of okay in that people are going to move in from independent into assisted, and they're going to move out into nursing, but they'll more or less offset one another in the short term, though you do have the risk of private payers just saying, I'm not going to pay. And so while generally people want private payers, this may be a one-time you want government pay. Nursing will do okay in the sense people will continue coming into it, and I include memory in that. And most of that is government pay at the end of the day. So they'll do okay relative to the others because to the extent it's government pay, it's not great pay, but they'll pay. You add a footnote to all this, is that unrelated to the coronavirus is the oil price situation, which for most of us is a good thing. Our gas prices, our heating oil, whatever, is much better. The problem is we're not allowed to fly or drive, small problem. So the fact that gasoline is cheaper than ever and would be really cheap if we drove down to Disney, since nobody is traveling and there's no Disney to go to, you can't really take advantage of it. On the other side of it, domestic oil-related activities are being killed from a profitability point of view and have a difficulty meeting their debt requirements because they were quite highly leveraged. And all this is less a fallout of Corona, although there's part of it on the demand side, as much as it is a Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Russia, which I think we would normally be a net beneficiary of, but given this situation, we can't benefit because we can't use it. Therefore, the footnote to all this is whatever I've just said, I say with 2 asterisks saying a lot more in a place like Houston that's very dependent on oil. Just to give you a sense, there are 330 million people in the United States. As of this morning, there were about 11,000 cases, and there were somewhere around 100 and some deaths. I'm not trying to say this is good or bad. It is. The flu, there will be somewhere between 36 and 51 million cases in the United States this year. Um, there will be, in the past week, the estimate is that we have about 40,000 deaths from flu a season. That's about 1,500 a week. So in the last week, more or less, you had 1,500 deaths from the flu. Yes, this is still expanding, and so I'm not trying to say they're exactly the same. My comment is, though, we can live with 1,500 people dying of flu during the season. It's very unpleasant for the family, but 1,500 a week is what's dying more or less from the flu until the spring warm-up occurs. By the way, we have about 1,600 deaths where diabetes is listed as the primary cause each week. And we have about 1,000 deaths each week related to the automobiles. So we are able as a society to deal with really horrible things. And we try to find ways to live with them. And so I think what we've got is a period where we decide if we can isolate this and flatten this a bit. But if we think we're going to flatten this for a year or 6 months, the cost of the economy is staggering. A couple of things, and I'll come back to. Well, let me say one more thing about the cost of the economy. If what we are going to achieve is to save 1% of the population from dying, and the cost of that is 30 to 50% of GDP, it's just very difficult for me to believe that is a sensible math decision for society. If you said that we can save 1% of the population by giving up 0.5% of GDP, maybe even 1% of GDP, maybe even 2% of GDP, you say, great. But when you start talking of shutdowns that extend and extend and extend, you're going to be talking about declines in the economy in the range of 30 to 50%. And we're saving 1% of the population. By the way, that decline is if it's only for 1 year. If we had to do it for 2 years, it's even more dramatic. So it's an important decision society is going to have to make. Society always has to make these decisions. We know people die of smoking, yet we let people smoke, and most of us take ways to protect ourselves. A couple of other things that I find interesting. So I live about 2 blocks from Independence Hall. That's where I'm sitting right now. And that was the center of America in 1793. The U.S. government was here. George Washington was the president. Independence Hall, on its one side was the Supreme Court. On the other side was Congress, and George Washington presided a block away. So this is my neighborhood. In 1793, in a matter of 8 to 10 weeks, there were 10,000 people died of the yellow fever epidemic. The total population of Philadelphia was 50,000. So within about 1.5 miles, 2 miles of where I'm sitting as I speak, there were 1,000 deaths a week from yellow fever out of a population of 50,000. The government left the city, as did about 20,000 other people, and, quote, isolated. And it then eventually ran its course. Interestingly, as best the data can show, GDP, they didn't have such a measure then, but you can imagine economic historians have recreated. Somehow, GDP in the United States actually grew that year by best estimates. Then if you flash forward to 1918 to 1919, the Great Spanish Flu Epidemic. I read the book about this about 10 years ago before anybody really focused on it. And Philadelphia was the epicenter of that, in that there was a parade down Broad Street, I think it was, to raise money for war bonds. and they debated should they cancel and isolate, and they did not isolate. And of course, remember, sanitation standards then were awful. People rarely bathed, they rarely washed. If they did, they shared the bath water with the whole family. If they did it once every week. In some cases, they shared the water with not only their family, but the other people on the floor. So sanitation standards were appalling at that point by modern standards. And Philadelphia had the highest death rate by far because they didn't isolate during that parade. Having said that, there were about 675,000 deaths in 24 months, roughly, from the Spanish flu. That was about 6% of the existing population, which was about 103 million. That amounted to about 6,500 deaths a week. I repeat, 6,500 deaths a week took place. So it meant everybody saw death happening in real time. 28% of the population was estimated to be infected. And yet somehow GDP grew. They did not shut down. You can imagine economic activity got spotty, but they did not shut down. GDP grew. During SARS, to give you another benchmark, there were about 8,100 cases contracted worldwide in 9 months, of which 774 died. And when the warm weather came, SARS disappeared and has yet to reappear. China, so far, with most of the activity concentrated in January and February, has about 81,000 cases and about 3,200 deaths. Remember, Spanish flu was 6,500 deaths a week, and the yellow fever in a very small country at the time was 1,000 deaths a week just in Philadelphia. And so China's had 3,200 deaths. The lockdown and quarantine seems to have done a pretty good job. There are a handful of new cases, but they all appear to be from people from outside coming in. And life is returning to normal. Factories are getting back to normal. Apple has opened all of its 42 stores. Another sort of piece of information is there have been 12 medical events since 1981 of some note. In these 12 events, S&P 500 dropped between 6 and 18% between the beginning of the event and the bottom. However, in 11 of those 12 instances, over the 6-month period from when it was first began, the market was up in 11 out of 12 instances, and the average was up by 8.8%. And in fact, if you look at the year following the beginning of the event, the medical event, and you did a 12-month, so this would be sort of coming back March 2021 equivalent, 11 out of the 12 events had positive S&P returns, with the average being 13.3, and the only one that was negative was minus 0.2. So will history repeat itself? I doubt it. We're down about 31%. So it's a much bigger drop than the previous. Having said that, there's plenty of evidence of previous overreacting by the stock market. There are tidbits of good news that don't get out. You have to search for them. They're doing an experimental vaccine in Seattle. They are they're working in India and a couple of other places with drug cocktails to treat cases that have occurred. Think of the HIV kind of cocktail treatments that are showing some positive impacts. And in fact, two Italian patients that got it were administered these drugs, and it seems to have worked, but we're too small a sample. In Erasmus Medical Center, they found an antibody that can perhaps fend off COVID-19. As I say, that the Cleveland Metro Health Medical Center has a test that they believe they can deliver in 2 hours rather than days. Both China and South Korea had dramatic drops in the number of new cases. Israel has a number of scientists, very good immunologist community, working on both vaccines and antibiotics, and believe they have some breakthroughs, but that will take time. There have been a number of fully recovered people. And in San Diego, they're working on a vaccine that is in early stages. They're working on with Duke and National University of Singapore. In India, they've also tried other types of treatments. So there are little skirmishes out there that hold some interesting news, though all those medical will take some time. In the near term, the key is, will warm weather kill it? Will it do the same as it does to the flu and SARS? Answer is, nobody knows. If it doesn't, in 3 to 4 weeks, it strikes me, your businesses are going to be huge accounts receivable in almost every business, but particularly if you're in the landlord business. And you're going to want to be husbanding your own cash. So do you want to pay your interest payment this month? Do you want to pay your lease this month? Become real questions. If after, 3 more weeks, nothing's happened, remember, we've then sacrificed a staggering amount of GDP over that time period. We are going to have to say, what's plan B? We'll have to, I think, open the economy and start adjusting by masks and gloves and hygiene, but say we have to get back to life and travel. I'll end by saying what I started with. No one knows. And I certainly am among those in the no one knows. But I hope that this has been helpful, and at least it gives you my thoughts. As always, I appreciate your interest. I apologize for the technical difficulties we had, and I look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully before too long. Thank you.